the French right-wing parties.
Right. I mean, the far right has been gaining traction for some time.
The far-right AfD is officially labeled as an extremist organization.
As a right-wing extremist.
With the far-right making gains.
Fascism is a sensitive topic here in Europe. Understandably so because of our history. You would think that European countries and governments would be very, very careful about emerging leaders, their political tendencies, and increasing defense budgets. Unfortunately, after the Second World War, the EU has been dominated by liberalism, except for a very short time when leftist parties did have some success, for example in France, Spain, Belgium, Germany, and so on. Under the careful guise of the US, Western Europe was pretty free to adopt their own social programs, a freedom which no other countries in the world have experienced. Their populations have seen amazing growth in economy, living standards, education, access to healthcare, etc. A part of this, which for some Europeans is hard to accept, is because defense was guaranteed by the US and NATO. Therefore, demilitarization was easy and necessary, considering the previous two conflicts which decimated the continent. The previous colonial powers, the UK, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Spain, were still profiting in some way or another from the subjugated peoples of their colonies. And even after the liberation movements heroically freed their respective countries, some of the exploitative systems remained very powerful and extracting resources, utilizing cheap labor, and enriching the imperial core. Some of the social programs which have benefited the people of Western Europe in particular have been spearheaded by socialist or communist parties in different countries. For the people living in Western Europe, it was a time of rebuilding their countries, social progress, growing inequality balanced by the government actually working for the people as well. However, lately, you surely have seen that right-wing extremist groups have become even more active than before. They were always on the internet, but not so much manifesting in public. These are neo-Nazis protesting immigration, welfare programs, talking about how the neo-Marxist George Soros is controlling the media, and brainwashing people. I have linked my previous video where you can see how the CIA and Capital have used anti-communist propaganda to undermine the USSR and Eastern Europe while establishing capitalism as the hegemonic power. So you might ask yourself, why am I saying that resurgencies of far-right sentiment is a result of liberal policies in the EU for the last 6 years? I will say that a lot of inspiration came from this 1969 text of the famous Kwame Ture called The Pitfalls of Liberalism, which I will reference a lot to compare how Kwame Ture found liberals in the 50s and 60s in the US versus how we see our EU figures. For context, Kwame Ture, whose real name was Stokely Standiford Churchill Carmichael, who was a Tribagonian American activist, so he was born in Trinidad and Tobago, but immigrated to the US when he was 11. He was very involved with the Black Power Liberation movement, leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and also named honorary Prime Minister of the Black Panther Party. Oh yeah, and he was also a leader of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Oh yeah, and he was offered a full graduate scholarship to Harvard. So Kwame Ture was a very careful thinker. He was a brave part of an oppressed community that fought local and federal levels of government and their sponsors to achieve higher degrees of freedom for black folk in the US. I have cited the website where you can read The Pitfalls of Liberalism, which I would highly recommend because it is very interesting, easy to read, and also short. So this might seem like a weird comparison since it's regional characteristics and how the US developed versus the EU, but I would say that liberalism is more accurately practiced in the EU right now, considering the Democrats, who are very overtly subscribing to Republican policies, not doing anything much otherwise. Now let's see what Carmichael has to say about the white liberals of his time. First, he establishes the premise on why we should be harshly criticizing liberals. They act as the centrists who do both sides are wrong type arguments. They recognize the level of injustice and oppression, but choose to condemn and make speeches about instead of actually trying to help the oppressed. Also, the liberal has a very capital-centric definition of justice. You can see this in the way EU liberal politicians approach Russia versus Israel. Since the first days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they talked about harsh sanctions and actually implementing them. And since then, the mother of all sanctions was approved for Russian individuals, businesses, government, exclusion from the SWIFT system. And guess what? Russia is still, to this day, slowly advancing into Ukrainian territory because of the US and EU failure of peace talks. And then look at Israel, which, if we're going to get into pre-October 7 history, we can see the hardship that Palestinians have endured for almost 80 years at this point, without taking into account the Balfour Declaration and the British Empire forcing settlers and expropriated Palestinians since 1917. But since October 7 and almost 2 years of ethnic cleansing, displacement and genocide, no sanctions have been put in place, but rather a government crackdown on protests, with the UK arresting people who oppose the genocide, as if that is the same as supporting a terrorist organization. Also, Germany cracking down on students and protesters on charges of anti-Semitism and maintaining public order, and many more, according to the Solidar Foundation. This happens in the context of Israel killing, by the lowest estimates, around 63,000 people, with thousands more missing, buried under all the rubble that is Gaza, wounding at least 157,000, and displacing around 2 million. And now, with the plans to settle in West Bank too, I wonder what EU officials' positions will be. Or, as Carmichael explains it, many people want to know why, out of the entire white segment of society, we want to criticize the liberals. We have to criticize them because they represent the liaison between both groups, between the oppressed and the oppressor. The liberal tries to become an arbitrator, but he is incapable of solving the problems. He promises the oppressor that he can keep the oppressed under control, that he will stop them from becoming illegal. In this case, illegal means violent. At the same time, he promises the oppressed that he will be able to alleviate their suffering in due time. Historically, of course, we know this is impossible, and our era will not escape history. He points out that none of the Western nations are opposed to violence, unless it is used by the oppressor to resist and liberate their nation, such as Bush recognizing Afghanistan freedom fighters when the USSR invaded them, and labeling them terrorists when those same freedom fighters opposed US-backed governments and dictators. The second pitfall of the liberal is that he is predisposed to stop conflicts, or as Kwame Ture points out, that confrontation has solved a number of problems, and that the liberal defends peace and stability on the side of the oppressor. We need not waste time showing that this assumption of the liberals is clearly ridiculous. I think that history has shown that confrontation in many cases has resolved quite a number of problems. Look at the Russian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. In many cases, stopping confrontation really means prolonging suffering. The liberal is so preoccupied with stopping confrontation that he usually finds himself defending and calling for law and order, the law and order of the oppressor. And so the politics of the liberal leads him into a position where he finds himself politically aligned with the oppressor rather than with the oppressed. Stopping conflicts from happening instead of siding with the oppressed is the liberals' way of maintaining the status quo, their way of keeping the oppressed weak and distracting them by mentioning the humanity and violence of the conflict, while not acknowledging or denying the violent systems under which the oppressed must suffer. In the Palestinian case, liberals either willingly do not understand that the suffering for the Palestinians started almost 80 years ago, and Hamas is a direct product of said oppression, ethnic cleansing, and displacement. The third pitfall of liberalism is that they are not able to present a real alternative to the current organization of the economy and the struggles that come out of said wealth inequality. Kwame Ture further established how nothing would endanger the position of the liberal. What the liberal really wants is to bring about change which will not in any way endanger his position. The liberal says, it is a fact that you are poor, and it is a fact that some people are rich, but we can make you rich without affecting those people who are rich. I do not know how poor people are going to get economic security without affecting the rich in a given country, unless one is going to exploit other people's. I think that if we follow the logic of the liberal to its conclusion, we would find that all we can get from it is that in order for a society to become equitable, we must begin to exploit other peoples. You can see this in action today with the austerity policies and trickle-down type of theories re-emerge due to the growing inequality. In Romania, for example, we have severe austerity measures due to the budget deficit caused by previous governments and their corruption in close proximity to capital. Whenever the liberal has solutions, if you can even call them that, like austerity, it is always at the advantage of the top 1% and theirs, so as not to feel the struggles of the majority of people. The fourth and last point of Kwame Ture is very interesting as he talks about how liberals seek influence rather than power. While conservative and far-right parties in the EU fight for majority and power to pass their abhorrent legislation, which targets minority groups, immigrants, bans protests, and really just fucks over the majority of the people, liberals want to be loud and heard about how they condemn the far-right and this and that. When winning elections, they do not enact the change and fail to meet most of the promises. It really feels like liberals are only there to criticize conservatives and right-wing parties and climb their moral high horse while perpetuating the same power structures that oppress people. And unfortunately, conservatives, nationalists, and the other far right are much more effective at communicating to the population and gaining support. I will give you a personal example. In Romania, ever since the elections in spring, the Liberal Party has been in power, governing with the other pro-European parties. They announced to pass austerity measures such as the VAT rate increase by 2%, higher state contributions for retired old people and employees, the reduction of scholarships and government grants to students from the first grade to university, and also a slight increase of taxes for business. But we are still one of the countries in the EU with the lowest taxes for the private sector. Anyway, at the latest polling for future elections, over 40% of the population said they support the far-right Our party. 17.3% of the rest support the current governing party, which are the Liberals, and the Social Democrats are at 13.7%. This is liberal ideology in practice. Cripple the working people, maintain the status quo, prolong the descent into fascism, which is 100% going to happen at some point, due to their inability to not only fight it, but most of the time side with it. Or as Kwame Ture puts it, these pitfalls are present in his politics because the liberal is part of the oppressor. He enjoys the status quo, while he himself may not be actively oppressing other people, he enjoys the fruits of that oppression. And he rhetorically tries to claim that he is disgusted with the system as it is. Now let's take a look at the most recent photo of the EU delegates in DC when Trump met with Zelensky. We will use this photo to show the EU leaders and their political ideology. Perhaps you have also seen another photo of them in the Oval Office, aligned like they were called to the principal's office for disciplination. So let's go from left to right. First is Keir Starmer. He is the Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party in the UK. His party is currently divided on the Palestinian genocide, and he has resisted recognizing a Palestinian state for years. The Labour Party has traditionally been leftist, but lately its liberal side has been activated, as recent polling shows. Support for him as leader of the Labour Party and the party in general has decreased significantly. This comes as the UK population is harshly criticizing their administration and policies, as growing wealth inequality causes economic instability. Also the fact that the UK is fueling Israel's genocide with arms. The second guy is Alexander Stubb. He's the president of Finland and member of the National Coalition Party, which is liberal conservative. He has voiced support for the two-state solution of Palestine and Israel, condemned Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and praised President Trump for his peace talks and negotiation initiatives, which are leading nowhere and will probably end with Russia annexing Ukraine territories and the US exploiting some limited rare earth minerals. The most interesting stance of the Finnish president comes in relation to China. I think it's a very interesting choice of words when talking about an enemy of the global hegemonic superpower and an ally of the said state, so China and Israel. Criticizing China's single-party hegemony and human rights violations, I'm not sure what he's referring to, maybe the Uyghurs in the northwest of China or something else. He says that our relations with China are different. China's actions are guided by values that differ from ours. The lack of democracy and the single-party hegemony are difficult for us to understand. Human rights violations, on the other hand, are impossible to accept. However, it is in our interest to maintain good and working relationship with China, and in certain sectors to enhance it further, both within the EU framework and bilaterally. So, you don't mind Israel inflicting genocide upon millions of Palestinians, but you do mind that China is an enemy of the US, both ideologically and because they are committing human rights violations, without giving a concrete example of what those human rights violations are. The third guy is Volodymyr Zelensky, and we will not talk about him because he's going through a cruel war of attrition. The fourth is Donald Trump. I don't think I need to add much here. He's a very determined fascist. But the fifth person is more interesting. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France and a member of the Renaissance Party, which is a very liberal, centrist type of organization. While President Macron has been accused of anti-Semitism because of his critique of Israel, he also had the initiative of recognizing a Palestinian state, which is good. But unless they pressure Israel into accepting these terms and ending the apartheid, well, it's just words. Macron has been quite vocal on the situation in Gaza and the West Bank. But as a liberal leader, he cannot confront the history and reality of the oppression Palestinians have faced for basically a century, and he condemns Hamas as if they started the war. I found this article concerning the hypocrisy of Macron and his government, which says that France has been delivering an uninterrupted flow of weapons and military equipment in general since October 7. Talks a lot about peace and justice, does nothing to actually bring about this change, but also arms the oppressor. Sounds a lot like European leaders. The sixth person is Giorgia Meloni. She is the Prime Minister of Italy and leader of the currently ruling party, the FDL. Perhaps you have heard of them. They are a neo-fascist far-right group who love the Roman salute, hate abortion and contraception, hate LGBTQ folk, and in general advocate for a traditional fascist way of organizing the economy and society in general. The administration has made it very clear that Israel has not received any arms from Italy. I will try to not speculate on why this is, but there were several reports of strong anti-Semitism coming from inside the FDL, which Meloni condemned. The seventh is Friedrich Merz, currently the Chancellor of Germany and ex-leader of the Christian Democratic Union. He is a conservative and huge apologist for the state of Israel. For example, in the recent airstrike on Khan Yunis hospital in Gaza, which killed at least 20 people, out of which 5 were journalists, Friedrich Merz said that Israel did not deliberately target said journalists in a double airstrike, one for causing chaos and killing patients, and the second right after first responders and journalists gathered to save patients and investigate the first airstrike, which is something that Israel for sure does not do. He only recently halted arms sales to Israel until further notice, but reiterates Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas terrorism. Horrible take again. Mentioning nothing about Palestinian right to defend themselves against a powerful ethno-state that wants their extermination and complete takeover of Gaza and the West Bank. I remind you that this is happening in the context of German government cracking down on student protests against Israel, calling them supporters of terrorists. Lastly, we have Mark Rutte, the current Secretary General of NATO and the biggest ass-kisser of Trump, famously asking him to go golfing together after they solved the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, but also calling him daddy. And I'm not joking.
Daddy has to sometimes use strong language to do
You have to use strong language. Every once in a while you have to use a certain...
Yeah, he basically called Trump daddy for his way of handling the Israel-Iran conflict. Mark Rutte was the leader of the VVD in the Netherlands, the People's Party for Freedom and Democracy, which is a conservative liberal coalition. Mark Rutte has promised unconditional support for Israel after October 7 before becoming Secretary General of NATO. The Jacobin publication has brought up the point that the Secretary General has denied many Israeli war crimes in order to be elected to his position in NATO. Other than that, he has not said much in terms of Palestinians being genocided. He supports Israel and is a good friend to Benjamin Netanyahu. So yeah, a real justice warrior, only for good causes. So yeah, these are the great European leaders in a nutshell. They stay silent in the face of historical oppression and injustice, in the face of genocide, only doing the minimal condemnation, not coming with real solutions. With potential conflicts sparking in many parts of the world, liberals and conservatives alike, in the face of fascism, choose to stay silent, follow the capital, get ordered around like some puppets by lobbyist groups and corporations, defend the status quo, and eventually it will culminate into a burst of fascism all over Europe. There are reports of neo-fascist parades and marches in most of the countries, some of which are not being cracked down on by police, like the fucking student protests on Israel. I guess we know where the priority lies for our leaders. Most of the trends are started by Trump, and unfortunately, EU leaders are quick to compliment the US president on his incredible performance and effort on whatever he might say, and follow him around like some very good dogs. How much power does the US have over NATO and EU policy? Well, still quite a lot. Although Trump's policies regarding especially tariffs have made EU leaders rethink their close relationships, and we know that much of the EU population disliking the American administration, liberals will still keep close proximity of power, and of course they would never approach China. Let's say for some cooperation talks. China being the major enemy of the US at the moment, this decision would upset the White House very, very much, though I am not the one to speculate what would this entail for Europe. Unfortunately, in Europe, just like in the US, there is no real alternative to these parties. The anti-communist sentiment embedded during the Cold War is still very present, and the leftist voices who have real solutions to these problems have been time and time again silenced. There is, however, a light at the end of the tunnel. All people, whether they be Dutch, Germans, Balkans, Italian, or whatever, must mobilize and keep protesting despite threats from the government, being loud and angry with their leaders, and demanding better conditions, disrupting the rule of the bourgeoisie, and demand justice for their brethren, be they in Palestine, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the US, Latin America, or whatever, in a show of solidarity with all workers of the world. I urge you to discuss among yourselves and do not become complacent, because the ruling class would love for you to stay silent while they do whatever they want and destroy the world in the process of doing that. Remember, this is all part of the class war. There should be no distinction between working people of the first world, second or third world. All of us are workers being exploited in many different ways, without regards of ethnicity, religion, skin color, or gender. Thank you everyone for watching. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see future content. I have also linked my Twitch channel, where I'm working on building an audience. My word to you guys is stay safe, spread love, and don't give up. There's always a better tomorrow, but we have to change ourselves today. See ya.